Archives of Prasar Bharati presents the timeless treasure of golden era.
Good evening and welcome to Living on the Edge. Just as human impact on the environment is not a new phenomenon, human concern about that impact is also not new. Protected forest areas, forerunners of present-day national parks, were first established in India in about 300 BC. Later, Emperor Ashoka established the first recorded hunting laws protecting certain species of mammals, birds and fish. Yet today, state governments across India are reversing 2 decades of conservation efforts by denotifying a number of sanctuaries. This week, Living on the Edge travels to the Melghat Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra to examine the dangers of denotification. We also reveal how unplanned growth is destroying hill stations in the north and toy with a new method of generating power. But first, denotification. For over 2 decades, sanctuaries and national parks, by virtue of specially designed laws, have protected hundreds of plant and animal species from the depredations of man. Over the past few years, however, political compulsions and commercial exploitation possibilities are prompting several state governments to denotify sanctuaries. Priya Somaya assesses a trend that could have disastrous consequences.
On our first day in the Melghat Tiger Reserve, the only animals we spotted were a lone sambar and a pack of langurs. Shy and elusive, even they disappeared in seconds. A forest official who accompanied us explained that the fact that these animals are not accustomed to humans is perhaps the best indicator that conservation is successful in keeping the sanctuary truly isolated and unspoiled. Nestled in the southern Satpuras, the Melghat Tiger Reserve extends over 1,600 square kilometers of Maharashtra's most picturesque forests. It is also home to animals as diverse as the bison, sambar, sloth bear, jackals and leopards. Thriving in this dry deciduous forest are also over 600 precious plant species, many with rare medicinal properties. Successful conservation is evident even in satellite pictures obtained by the Forest Research Institute, which show not only that the forest cover has remained unchanged, but also actually growing in certain areas. And yet the Maharashtra government has ordered 1/3, or roughly 500 square kilometers of Melghat, to be denotified, together with the 39 villages that lie inside the forest area. Denotification is being carried out apparently to allow tribal communities living on the reserve to subsist without disturbing the forest. For centuries, the Korkus, Gonds and Gaulis have lived in harmony with nature. But today, numbers have increased so considerably that survival on existing resources is untenable. Besides, a huge cattle population is competing for food with the wild herbivores, and large areas are being degraded.
If we redraw our line and put these villages out, I think we are not losing much, but the gain is much more. because the restrictions would be less on people. Plus you think about shifting of all these 58 villages, finding an area which would be all right from social point of view, from agricultural point of view, and resettling them. We'll have to resettle them in the forest area.
Some other state government officials living on the edge contacted agreed that denotification was not in the best interests of conservation. Others felt it was justified, but all insisted that the controversy was sub judice and refused to go on record. Environmentalists, however, claim that rather than solving the problem, denotification will worsen it.
Now, if you decrease the area of the sanctuary, that in effect is going to allow increase in human pressures and increase in cattle populations in the area that has been denotified. The moment that happens, the biotic pressures are going to fall on what is the remaining 1100 square kilometers, and that also is going to get nibbled away bit by bit.
The impact of shrinking wild animal habitat is already evident. The intrusion of man into forest areas is bringing him into conflict with wild animals.
ढोर चराते चराते हम समझो पानी पिलाने को समझो पीने गए समझो तो उत्ते में धापड़ी पे शेर आ गया। शेर आने के बाद में भैंस भी मार डाला, गैया भी, हेला भी मार डाला एक। 2 दिन का बाद में और वही जगह में हमारा गोरा भी मार डाला है।
गायची लंगार डोंगरात उभी तिच्या भोवती म्हशी चरती, गाय की दूध नको काढू रे, पाहिल कुणीतरी औंदाच्या ग वर्षाला शेवळी रस्त्यात खंदली ग.
ऐसे कुछ हुआ है कि आदमी को उठा के ले गए?
और बाप रे, हाँ कितने होगा ना। ये अपने पीली में तो शेर ने खा डाला बच्चे को। अच्छा इतना बड़ा बच्चे को भैंस चराने को गया तो अब 5 बजे आ रहा था वो। 5 बजे आ रहा था तो सामने सामने भैंस, पीछे पीछे हुआ, और वो इतने बड़े सगुन के डेंगड़े के नीचे दबा था तो भैंस को ने पकड़ा उसने और वो बच्चे को लेकर पटक दिया।
Although killing of an innocent child is unfortunate, it is inevitable as long as humans continue to stray where the law of the jungle is supreme, and things can only get worse after denotification. After all, how does the administration intend to inform the tiger and other wild animals that the boundaries of their habitat have been altered, that they are suddenly no longer sheltered from the outside world, and that the special laws that protect the biodiversity within the area will no longer be valid?
Outside the sanctuary and national park, if the tree is felled, it applies only with Indian Forest Act, where punishment is prescribed with 6 months imprisonment and fine up to ₹2,000. If the same tree is felled inside the sanctuary or national park, the provisions of Indian Forest Act as well as Wildlife Protection Act apply, and we can prosecute the offender under both the acts.
And if you look at it in purely monetary terms, this is about 500 square kilometers, which translates into 50,000 hectares. And I would say that the commercial value of just the timber in this kind of forest would be more than 1 crore rupees per hectare. So the kind of money we are talking about is 50,000 crores.
Development and commercial exploitation of the forests may make sense to man, but to the tiger, bison, deer, and hundreds of other creatures, it implies the destruction of their homes, forced migration, violent disruption of their natural cycles, and ultimately death. Sadly, Melghat's predicament is not unique. All over the country, denotification threatens an incredible wealth of diversity in existing reserves. Whether it is political compulsions, bureaucratic ineptitude, or simply the lure of commercial gain, the reasons vary, but the consequences are the same.
1991, the Darlaghat sanctuary protecting the Chakor partridge was denotified to make way for a cement factory. 1992, Pirotan Island in Gujarat's Marine National Park was proposed for denotification by an oil refinery. proposal was later withdrawn. 1992, the coastal forests of the Balukhand Sanctuary proposed for denotification to allow setting up of a hotel complex. 1993, part of the Narayan Sarovar denotified so that a cement industry could be set up. 1993, in Arunachal, Mehaus rainforest protecting the Hulak gibbon proposed for denotification. 1994, Bhitarkanika Sanctuary in Orissa, one of the last havens for the endangered olive ridley turtle, proposed for denotification to allow trawler operations. 1994, Melghat Sanctuary loses 1/3 of its area due to denotification.
Public interest groups have gone to court, and in many cases, denotification has been stayed, pending a final judgment. Whilst it is impossible to say what the courts will decide in individual cases, it is apparent that denotification, if ratified, will negate 2 decades of conservation achieved against overwhelming odds across the country. Worse, it will open floodgates to a host of anticipated environmental problems which may take decades to resolve.
Now, these are amongst the last areas where natural resources are left, where minerals are left, where forests are left, where rivers are still undammed, etc. And the whole liberalization and new economic thrust that has come up in the 1990s, early 90s, that has given the signal that all these areas are now expendable, that you can do away with them.
Consider this. Our protected forests comprise only 4% of our land area, but are home to over 200,000 species of living organisms. And if our short-sightedness opens these pockets to development, many species may simply vanish completely. Yes, it is possible to save a few hundred species in zoos and to store their embryos in deep freeze to enable the propagation of chosen species. But it is impossible to recreate truly wild habitats that have evolved over thousands of years. More importantly, unless man learns to live in harmony with nature, he will be sowing the seeds of his own destruction. History is replete with examples of the most developed civilizations simply fading away because they destroyed the delicate ecological balance.
Species generally become rare before they become extinct. To feel no surprise at the rarity of a species, and yet to marvel greatly when the species ceases to exist, is much the same as to feel no surprise at sickness. But when the sick man died, to wonder and to suspect that he dies by some deed of violence.
It is said that people are not moved to action unless they see a problem clearly with their own eyes. When change is slow, it passes unnoticed. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Shimla and other hill stations of North India. Once summer retreats for our erstwhile colonial masters, they are today a little more than congested, polluted towns lacking basic amenities, as our executive producer Nikhil Alva discovered. If names like Nainital, Manali or Shimla conjure up images of beautiful little cottages set against a backdrop of mist-covered mountains, gushing streams with crystal clear water, thick forests teeming with wildlife, or simply clean, fresh air, silence, and very few people, then the present-day reality of these towns and cities will come as a rude shock. Shimla, like most other hill stations, was once a sleepy little hamlet in the Himalayas, at least until it was discovered by the British. In fact, so fascinated were the British by its great natural beauty and easy accessibility that within a few decades it grew to be the summer capital of their empire. And in keeping with that status, no expense or effort was spared to plan, develop and beautify it. And yet today, Shimla presents a picture of organized chaos and decay. It has grown into a vast concrete jungle bursting at its seams. Apart from being a major tourist destination and a heritage town, Shimla is also the capital of the state of Himachal Pradesh. As a result, while it had been planned to cater to the needs of about 20,000 people each summer, it has a static population of 1 lakh, swelled by periodic arrivals of thousands of tourists.
City was never built to cope with this kind of population. Apart from that, if it's a permanent population of, let's say, over 1 lakh of people, say 120 lakhs or 130 lakhs, I don't know the precise figures, you must be having an equal number of people coming up during the peak seasons, which would still be summer and autumn. So this city was not planned, the roads were not planned, the water supply was not planned.
As a result, what was once truly the queen of the Himalayas is dying a slow death. Just listen to what old residents of the erstwhile summer capital have to say about a transformation they find hard to accept.
I've been living here for the last 25 years, and over the years I've seen Shimla change drastically, not for the better, but regarding the surroundings of Shimla, it's changed for the worse. It has become more crowded, it has become more ugly, it's become more noisy and much more polluted than it was.
शिमला में सिर्फ मेरे ख्याल एक डिब्बा बंद शहर ही ज़्यादा बेहतर रहेगा इसके लिए कि डिब्बे ही रखे हुए हैं चारों तरफ, लोग उनमें बंद हैं, सुबह निकलते हैं, शाम को जाके फिर अपने डिब्बे में बंद हो जाते हैं। आप किसी भी हाउस में जाके विजिट कीजिए, कहीं पर आपको धूप में आने के लिए जगह नहीं, बच्चों के खेलने के लिए कोई पार्क नहीं।
Although old-time residents are disillusioned, even angered by the noise, the pollution, the ever-increasing vehicular traffic, and the crowds once alien to their existence, to the outsider, Shimla still retains much of its old-world charm. Its colonial heritage and easy accessibility by road, air, and even rail attract lakhs of visitors each year.
This place is gorgeous, and after visiting Delhi with all the pollution and the crowds and masses of people, this place is paradise on earth presently.
We had seen a lot of Shimla in the movies. We had made an idea from that.
I'm coming from Calcutta, it's so much crowded. I don't think this is crowded.
But what tourists don't realize is that their descending on Shimla in such large numbers has had several unforeseen consequences. The frenzied race to cash in on the ever-increasing tourist traffic and raise profits associated with tourism have resulted in the mushrooming of hundreds of hotels and guest houses, many of which have been built in blatant contravention of existing laws. Apart from being proverbial eyesores, these constructions threaten the stability of the slopes they've been built upon.
And that is in spite of the fact that Shimla is sinking. And about 2 years ago we had a tragedy in Shimla. A structure had come up, and during the rains the entire building slipped down.
Construction of a high-rise building, heavy buildings, cause the increase of the load on the slopes. And the slopes are already in an unstable condition. Therefore, the increasing density of the building would cause instability of the slopes, and which would result in landslides or landslips.
Degradation of the land is compounded by the overuse of groundwater. Water shortages are an obvious consequence.
टूरिस्ट आते हैं तो हमारे को पानी की बड़ी कमी हो जाती है, पानी का बहुत हो जाता है, पानी की कभी मिलता कभी नहीं भी मिलता.
And with government policy geared towards increasing tourism further, the pressure on water and land can only increase. Strangely enough, the government appears to have sacrificed the needs of ordinary residents by concentrating only on the tourists.
आदमी को यहाँ पे 2000 रुपये पे मिलती है, और सीजन में यहाँ टमाटर का रेट 20 रुपये किलो हो जाता है, 24 रुपये किलो हो जाता है, तो सहन नहीं कर पाता इस महंगाई को. बाहर से लोग आते हैं, वो 2 दिन रह के चले जाते हैं, लेकिन महंगाई उनके साथ वापस नहीं जाती है।
Tourism essentially is a trade-off, and you really have to know where to draw the line between, let's say, these socio-economic benefits which accrue to the people or to the state because of tourism, and where we should say, okay, the needs of ecology and environment are such that we should have this number and no more.
Perhaps one way of striking a balance is to develop other areas as alternate destinations. Of late, policy planners seem to have woken to the realization that remedial steps are called for.
We are trying to shift the focus of tourism from these so-called saturated towns like Shimla, Manali.
Just how long concrete action will take is impossible to say. To the beleaguered inhabitants of Shimla, those who don't thrive on tourism, the summer months are a reflection of a dream gone sour. They see what the ephemeral tourist doesn't see: the gradual deterioration and eventual destruction of a once proud hill station. When Living on the Edge asked residents how they saw their hometown 20 years hence, their answers were far from optimistic.
Shimla per hill station to nahi rahega, it will be just like the other plain places.
निराश होकर जाने वाली बात है, फिर तो डिसअपॉइंट होने वाली बात है कि जो यहाँ पे आएगा। पहले प्रकृति अगर कम हो गई तो फिर हिल स्टेशन का कोई मतलब नहीं रह जाएगा।
The air would become like Delhi. We'd all start wearing masks. We wouldn't be able to breathe.
शिमला ऑर्डिनरी जैसे आप देखते हैं मोहाली वगैरह है, आप चंडीगढ़ का नाइबरिंग उतना अच्छा भी नहीं हो सकता, यहाँ स्पेस नहीं उतना, तो ऐसे ऑर्डिनरी सिटी बन के रह जाएगा।
Effective waste disposal in rural areas demands imagination, flexibility, and use of locally available raw materials. Sunil Manoharan recently discovered an alternative to diesel that can meet the energy shortfall in rural areas.
The Rajaji National Park in Uttar Pradesh was once the focus of controversy when the original inhabitants, the Gujars, were to be moved out to protect the forest. Today, the flora and fauna within the park are under threat, and this time the culprit is not man but an insidious, silent killer, the lantana weed. The weed multiplies inexorably, destroying the growth of natural foliage and robbing animals of food. Unfortunately, the problem is not confined to the park. The weeds have begun appearing all over the country, prompting scientists to find ways of destroying them as efficiently and as profitably as possible. For over 10 years, Professor Grover and his team at the Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi, have been involved in developing ways to generate power in remote rural areas using locally available waste. And what has emerged is a cheap and simple means of reducing the consumption of diesel while providing an equivalent amount of fuel.
This gasifier basically works on partial combustion. That means when we restrict the amount of air to burn the biomass, the gases produced are combustible. And since these gases have energy, if we feed it to the diesel engine, then diesel engine will reduce the consumption of diesel by about 80%.
It isn't as complicated as it sounds. First, biomass materials like lantana, arhar dal stalk, and twigs of bushy plants are fed into this drum charring unit. The drum is then closed, made airproof, and then heated. What emerges is charcoal, which is fed into the gasifier and ignited. The gases emitted help run diesel engines, reducing the consumption of the fuel by 80%.
I think this is very useful for a country like India, with a vast country with so many remote areas where there are no chances of getting electricity, grid power. I think it is very useful, and number of thousands of these gasifiers can be put up for village applications.
But wider dissemination of this technology requires the help of NGOs, to organize biomass collection, educate the villagers, and maintain the units. What makes the technology feasible is a 60% subsidy offered by the government. That means that a 20 horsepower unit would cost the village 80,000 rupees, or 40% of the cost. Besides being sustainable, the technology would be a step towards decentralization and a realistic alternative to electricity provided by the grid.
At least 3 million people are poisoned by pesticides each year, of whom 20,000 die.